Welcome, dear ISS community and guests. We're here today to celebrate 69 years of ISS and to look into the near future. Where to go? Where do we go from here? We're not live? Oh. My name is Lynn Zebeda. I hope you can all see me. There was a little bit of confusion here. But my name is Lynn Zebeda. I am a social entrepreneur and a researcher at our company, Dr. Monk. I'm also a proud ISS alumna. I graduated here in 2007, which feels really strange. I'm feeling very at home right now, happy to be here. And today we will look at a few major themes that are shaping the future of the world and therefore also the future of ISS. Who will ISS be in 5 years' time? That's us as a whole ISS community that you're all a part of as well. And to kick us off today and to properly welcome us in is Rector Inge Hutter. Welcome, Inge.
Thank you, Lynn.
So good to be here together at the table.
Great to see you, yes.
Yeah. Please, take the floor,
I will do. So I'll use the camera there to address everyone. A very warm welcome here in ISS. We are online, but also a couple of participants are here. We are on the balcony in the atrium. You will recognize, I think, where we are. A warm welcome to all of you, students, researchers, colleagues, friends, and also the alumni all over the world. So very happy to be here and to be able to hear. We're just coming out of the Corona crisis and the new students started in September. The building is back with buzz of the students and we're enjoying to meet each other again. So it's a special time to be back in the building. So a question actually after coming back from Corona is now, well, do we go back to the normal, the old normal, or do we go to a new normal? And that's what we're going to do today, to reflect on also what we learned through Corona. Because it has been a bad time, heavy time, but also for sure we learned things that we do not want to lose and will bring forward to the future. So one example is of course the online teaching. Everyone has been so busy with it, but also gathering expertise in that. So one of the issues we're really going to look at, well, what is the future on online teaching? What can we do together? And there will be innovations in our teaching and our curriculum as well. And another nice example is the IADI conference that was completely online. And actually the participation from researchers from the Global South was much higher than ever before. And also the Global South was much more visible than we before had. So that's really a reason to go more online or hybrid together. So the question, back to the old normal or to a new normal? And well, my answer would be a new normal, but then what would it look like? So today at the Dies, we're 69 years old. Next year, 70 years, so we have a lustrum. And at the same time also we're going to develop the strategy of 2023-27. So basic questions actually, well, who will be next year when we are 70 years old, celebrating our lustrum, but also who will we be in 2027 when we are 75 years old. So that's a basic question at the moment, and I'm very much looking forward to the presentations, the topics, the discussions on it, and enjoy. And Lynn, I give back to you.
Thank you, Inge, for grounding us in this conversation. So we will dive into 3 themes today, one by one. We'll start with decolonizing knowledge, then we'll go into technology and development, and lastly, social enterprise. With 3 super interesting external speakers and some familiar ISS faces and critical thinkers that you can see sitting around me. So very much looking forward to our conversations, everyone. Last but not least, you yourself will be able to interact via a very simple tool called Mentimeter. So I invite you to please go to the website menti.com, and put in the code that we have for today. The code is 148000750. You can see it in the screen as well. And then you'll be able to ask your questions, to vote for interesting questions, and to give your input. So we'd be very happy to see you on there. So let's dive right in with our first topic of decolonizing knowledge. And to do that, I would like to welcome our first speaker of the day here, Dr. Althea Maria Rivas. Welcome, Althea. Happy to see you. I cannot hear you yet.
Can you not hear me yet?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah, there we are.
Okay.
So you're joining us from SOAS, where you're a researcher, a lecturer, convener of the Humanitarian Action Master's Program. You have a lot of hats on, and you have a lot of knowledge on the topic of today. So I can't wait for you to tell us more about yourself and your work a little bit, and what you have to offer on this topic of decolonizing knowledge. And before you start, I would like to ask our audience again to go to menti.com, enter the code 148000750, and put in your questions for the Q&A. We'll be able to interact later on. So, Althea, please take it away.
To start, I wanted to thank Lynn, Inge, and Femike and colleagues at ISS for inviting me to participate in this anniversary celebration and reflection today, and for all of the hard work that they've done into putting the event together and making it happen. So, as Lynn just said, I'm a senior lecturer in development studies at SOAS, the University of London, in London. I'm based at the London campus. And I'm a feminist decolonial researcher who uses a lot of innovative grounded methodologies in my work. So I like using photo voice, storying, and narratives to explore debates in conflict, security, and development. Kind of the politics of intervention, but I also work in Liberia and the Afro-diasporic or spaces where Afro-diasporic and indigenous communities occupy, looking at the racialized and gendered nature of the processes and politics of aid, violence, and of peace. So today, I'm just going to say a few words about what decolonizing means, rethinking kind of knowledge and research and how we generate knowledge, and some of the things that we can think about as we approach decolonizing our research spaces. So the decolonizing agenda for me is about ultimately dismantling power hierarchies, different methods that we use, and in the spaces that we create to understand our world. So central to that is dismantling power hierarchies, decentering Europe, and reclaiming indigenous and marginalized ways of knowing and being. So at the core of this project, then, are these questions of knowledge production, legitimacy, and our everyday practice. So thinking about how can we refocus our ontology? What are we looking at? Rethinking our epistemologies, reconstructing our methodologies, rethinking representation as well. So how do we share and locate this knowledge and communicate it? And who do we communicate it to? And political action, because the decolonial project is not just one of theorizing. So it requires doing things differently, not just theorizing about change. So ultimately, we're engaged in a project that seeks to tear down dominant systems of knowledge production and power for a more just one, a more just world that emerges from different ecologies of knowledge, to borrow a term. Many have kind of begun to argue that decolonizing is a buzzword. It's rhetorical, it really holds no meaning, and it's just kind of a fad of the moment. And definitely, the movement to decolonize the university, the curriculum, and somewhat research has become quite popular recently, right? But the imperative to decolonize, I think it's bold, and it comes from a long history of critiques, of resistance, of social movements, advanced by people in the global south and marginalized communities in Europe and the Americas and around the world, really, that have held at their core that desire to transform colonialism, its legacies and white supremacy, and also its partners of capitalism and patriarchy. And these grassroots movements around the world have been led by communities of indigenous people, of slaves, of freedmen, people in the global south, and marginalized groups in the global north, seeking to reclaim their space and center their lives and ways of being in a global story, which is our global story. It is the story, really. Caribbean that provided the basis for European, quote unquote, development and capitalist expansion. This happened both through slavery and colonial extraction, were constructed really in opposition to Europe. So race and racialization of these populations comes into being with the advent of European invasions of the global South. And therefore, racism is the foundation upon which colonialism and imperial expansion were built. So once it conquered and colonized the rest of the world, Europe imposed its own ontology that displaced others, as Said tells us. And because the violence, enslavement, and genocide that accompanied colonialism couldn't be justified just because of the economic benefit of Europe alone, it needed a moral argument by so-called scientific research. In his book, Define and Rule, Mahmoud Mandani argues very compellingly that every colonial conqueror was preoccupied with the native question, and therefore research became a critical part of the imperial colonial project. So the European anthropologist or the European scholar became an important agent in producing knowledge and generating data that was desperately needed by colonialism to deal with this nagging native question and to justify the violence of colonialism, the dehumanization of slavery, and of genocide. And within the academy, we continue to reproduce racialized in new and complex ways through everyday encounters. So today, as researchers, if we endeavor to decolonize our work in our institutions, we must struggle against the disorienting fact that to truly decolonize our institutions would require perhaps the end of many institutions of education as we know them. Right? So it means working against knowledge paradigms that emerge from the colonial project, racism and global hierarchies of power, and reordering these structures, questioning knowledge, and a rejection of these colonial imaginaries that we still hold on to today. So Walter Mignolo talks about epistemic disobedience, which means calling into question the basis of and the control of European of thought done to humanity and to nature as a story of violence, rather than casting European knowledge as the frame through which we understand the world, and repositioning those who have been objects of research into the questioners and the knowers. So this requires, therefore, more than adding names to an article or recognizing that there may be a history of African political thought. It means engaging with that knowledge in ways that allow you to recreate a new global story. And that is a much more difficult task because often we learn the theoretical critique. So for example, we may understand the importance of participatory research methodologies as a means to engage. But then we juxtapose those same perspectives and kind of stuff them into Western frameworks and standards. So even ultimately, I suppose, as we learn new literatures and ideas and participate with these communities or engage these communities in participation, we sometimes just end up recentering Europe and revalidating European knowledge. So understanding the impact of these stories, unlearning old stories and learning how to create this new knowledge and center this new knowledge is an imperative that takes time. Because we must also construct new linkages between these different temporalities and realities, and that sometimes can also be an uncomfortable act, where many stories are connected and contribute to our understanding of justice, of equality, sovereignty, peace, and the possibilities of new economic and political structures. So decolonizing knowledge or recentering new knowledges or different types of knowledge, therefore, doesn't happen in a single moment or event or by using a toolkit or a checklist. Those things can be helpful prompts along the way, but really it's a long and complicated and complex process of undoing and unlearning the ways in which we've all been taught to value each other, to value particular types of knowledge, to understand history, and to engage with each other. Process. And it's through these different processes of learning and unlearning and making connections between these disparate communities that have fought and resisted colonialism and its legacies over time that the researcher is transformed, our own identities are formed, and our world is recreated and reshaped. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm taking it all in. It's extremely interesting and cross-cutting what you're saying. Thank you for this introduction. I would like to invite to our conversation Dr. Rosalba Icaza, who is an associate professor here at ISS. One of your major research areas is also decolonial feminism, decolonial thinking, and global politics. You guided me in writing my thesis all those years ago, so it's really, really nice to sit with you here and also reflect on this crucial topic.
Yes.
And maybe we can start I can start with asking you, to what extent has ISS already succeeded in decolonizing itself? And to what extent what should we still be trying to achieve?
Okay, well, before we started our conversation, actually, I was mentioning to you that the future has arrived to ISS in the sense that we have, at least for the 5 years, been systematically introduced the decolonial option as one way in which we can actually start a conversation about the colonial legacies of development studies as a field of knowledge. And this has happened not only through pedagogies, particular pedagogical interventions in the curricula of ISS, but it has also happened through different interventions in research methodologies. So when the question of where do we want to go, I think immediately that we need to perhaps start a process of looking back to the different efforts that we have been actually brought to ISS for transforming the curriculum in one, as Althea was mentioning before, that is not just about including particular ways of understanding what is development, what is supposed to be changed, but also that can help us to reconstitute actually what is the purpose of institutions like ISS. And we are doing it not just alone, we are doing it with students, with many networks that for decades have been involved in transforming curriculums, not only from the Americas, but also from different countries here in Europe that are in conversations precisely on introducing ways in which we can position our canons.
Yeah. Can I just ask you, because what Althea was saying has quite far-reaching consequences, and you're also saying that it redefines the purpose of an institution like ISS. What is that new purpose then?
Well, one of the things that perhaps is important that we put on the table and on the conversation is that research has already been done about how to decolonize institutions like ISS here in the Netherlands, but in many other contexts.
Yeah.
And one of the purposes of establishing different, let's say, directions of an institution like this one has been, for example, the role that universities are called to play for, let's say, having more social impact in the kind of knowledge that we produce. So the moment you start to inquiry about where our stories are coming, in studying what is supposed to be human nature or politics, that is actually happening at the moment that we are speaking in one of the introductory courses in ISS, we are actually expanding the possibility of understanding that there is one canon, one dominant canon, but it's not enough, it's monocultural, and we want and we can introduce in dialogue and in conversation different, let's say, explanations, cosmologies, but also different stories of how this idea of human nature, politics of the state came to emerge in the first place. So just by having these conversations, I think that we can have a much more clear idea of what is the role of these institutions. Opening these conversations is one of the things that we have been doing.
Okay. I want to get even a bit more concrete and I would like to ask you both, Rosalba and Althea, if we think about the curriculum at ISS, you're already starting to think about it. Research areas. I heard Althea say things like we need epistemic disobedience, we need to create new knowledge, we need to do unlearning, because research is often about learning, but how do we unlearn, right? What do you think needs to change concretely in terms of the curriculum in a place like ISS and what is being researched or unresearched, maybe?
Okay. Well, in terms of the curricula, for example, we have now, as I was mentioning, a term 1 course in which we approach the philosophy of politics or Western modern philosophers, let's put it with more precision, in dialogue with genealogies and ontologies, authors that are writing from non-Western ontologies and non-Western modern epistemology. So this means that one concretely way in which we are doing.
For some of us that have not heard them
for
in
example,
15 years.
we are exploring the limitations of an understanding of politics coming from the Greeks, and having a conversation on how, from an ontology of Mesoamerican Andes, the notion of politics doesn't take as point of departure unity, but relation. What does it make for students coming here to learn about politics, to start thinking not just on unity, like for example in the Hegelian style, or thinking about the state as a unity, but actually thinking on relations, which it's very important later on for designing what you want to research.
I would like to also bring in Althea at this point. I would like to, with the same question, if you think about curriculum, research, unlearning, epistemic disobedience, what does that concretely mean? What would you change in a curriculum, if you want to honor that?
Sure. So I think Rosalba already raised some really good points. So maybe I'll approach it from a slightly different angle. I think it's really important that scholars approach these discussions with intellectual humility and a commitment to kind of address completely how colonization and its imaginaries shape our institutions and our work, right? Because often as we kind of engage in the decolonial or critical conversations, there's an attempt to kind of reclaim some sort of position of criticality or moral high ground that's attached to how, things are already being done, or the status quo, right? And this is sometimes really want to reflect on how their own everyday practice, or even the way that their careers have been constructed, have benefited from these types of silences or erasures. So I think it's important to create a space for uncomfortable conversations, also failures maybe, right, or unsettling thoughts. And to not try and resolve these things with, because they're complex problems, with uncomplicated solutions, or like tick boxes, for example, right? Because when you create a module, it's not just a series of topics, it's really a story that you're creating, right? You're saying that these are the things you should know. And part of that is also thinking about who's in our spaces, right? So, for example, I'm also in development studies, just like Rosalba. And in the UK, development studies is a very white field. It's very white and it's very European in terms of the faculty and the researchers, right? And I think that sends a particular message, right? So we have a lot of students from the Global South coming to the Global North and learning about development and developing their spaces from Europeans, and that reinforces that kind of colonial relationship. Right? So we can't...
Can we go a bit deeper into that? Like, indeed, what it means for student population, for researchers' population. I can imagine, indeed, it's one obvious thing is to bring people in from the Global South. It's not the greatest term, but have more balance in that. But maybe we can think beyond that as well. What would it mean for the student population if we were to successfully decolonize, and the researchers' population? Can one of you respond to that?
Do you want to go out there, or do you want me to take it out?
You can go ahead, Rosalba, and then I'll add on.
Well, I would love to go back to something that you said. We also need to think what is the population that we are talking. One of the learnings of decolonial thinking is that instead of constantly abstracting, we need to position the kind of interventions and the kind of knowledge that we want to create. And when you are saying, well, people is coming here, but people is coming here also to have an experience of life, to be transformed in the process of coming in conversation and in dialogue with people that is radically different from them. So it's not just the canon, it's the experience of being in the presence of people that is radically different from you, and that opens the possibility for what Althea was saying, uncomfortable conversations. But in terms of research, for example, for the first year here in ISS, we are going to offer a course on decolonial research, in which we are going to be focusing very much on how we relate to each other within the field of development studies, but also in relation to how we construct our, let's say, research designs, from which point of departures we are actually starting our idea of what is there to be researched, and take the time to really focusing on where are we positioned,
Yeah.
where we start to say, I want to know this. We want to really help students to understand that they occupy a position
Yeah.
for
Not
building
a
this
neutral
knowledge.
one.
No,
Yeah.
it's not an abstract one.
Yeah.
They come with all their stories, their bodies, their genders, their stories from their countries, their own pedagogies, different traditions of pedagogical thinking that all come here to ISS. So it's an
Yeah.
excellent space to do this kind of work,
Yeah.
I think so.
Great.
And well,
We have a question from our audience that I would like to bring in because it's pretty much similar to what we're talking about. How can we practice decoloniality as students, faculty, or teachers? It's a good question because now we're talking about how one should do it, but if you really think about yourself, how do you practice it? Being a person in an institution. Maybe Althea can react to that one.
Yeah, I think that really starts with a self-reflexivity, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about, because the Decolonial Project is one of tearing down power hierarchies, right, and recentering Europe. So understanding, I think, going back to what Rosalba was saying, your own positionality, right, and how
Yeah.
you may inadvertently reinforce those relationships in your relationships with your students, with your colleagues, right, with the researchers and research communities that you engage with, is a fundamental step in that decolonial theory or ideas, Frantz Fanon and Manolo, and putting those things on the curriculum and understanding theoretically how that works, but
just
not centering it in their
positionality-
practice.
Exact positionality, as in who are you asking this question? How have you been shaped? What makes you ask these questions? What is your frame of reference, basically?
Your
that
frame
what
of
you're saying?
reference, but also your practice.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not just a theoretical exercise, it is about your practice. And the colonial kind of mindset or relationalities, they manifest themselves in everyday practice within the to be able to take a step back and think about how you yourself engage in those practices
Yeah.
before you're able to kind of undo them.
Yeah.
And a recognition that that's very common in the university.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm also here trying to break it down because you guys have such beautiful vocabulary talking about it. Indeed, positionality, self-reflexivity, epistemic disobedience. This is new language that we also have to learn how to speak, right, in a way. Okay, maybe a final question here to you is what obstacles do you see if an institution like ISS says like we want to go all in on this, it's important that we decolonize. What are obstacles that you might encounter?
well, I think that I tend to always see obstacles as opportunities. So you are asking the wrong person
Okay.
that question.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
I do believe that ISS is not existing in a vacuum. I also understand that with this strong challenging for decentering what Althea was saying, Europe, comes different possibilities and different obstacles. And something that I have learned over the years doing research about universities, about canons, about the institutions of governance of canons, is that you have to invite different perspectives to the table.
Yeah.
And one way in which you can actually overcome those obstacles is actually having this research in which you have different perspectives, the whole spectrum from positivism to anti-colonial and decolonial research that at least work in the case of our research we conducted at University of Amsterdam. And that actually help us to challenge and to challenge the obstacles and bring into the conversation that we wanted to have, that was diversity is not just who is in the building, but it's actually something that we need to explore in the canons and something that we need to ask what for we are bringing different ontologies, different epistemologies. Having those conversations, having people involved from different perspectives, different disciplines, different majors, help us. So the context might be challenging, but I think that precisely an institution like ISS and a field like development studies is a very fertile ground.
Yeah.
At least it has, at least in the case of Althea and myself, it has gave us some opportunities to bring our networks, to work on research that has employed a decolonial approach, and also to open the possibility of reflecting. This is a conversation, at least as it is framed as decolonial, that has more than 30 years in Latin America and the Spanish-speaking world. And if we start our conversation earlier with thinkers like Fanon, is even before that. And if you go even before that, it's a conversation that has long term there, and there is many work to do, many homework to do, many texts to read, and many authors and thinkers that that we can also bring into our conversations in a curricula for development studies.
Yeah. Althea, some last thoughts about this? Like, what might be the obstacles we need to watch out for if we want to achieve this?
Rosalba is right. Right now there's a real opportunity and kind of energy around decolonizing, and I think for a discipline like development studies, it's imperative to make the most of that. The obstacles are usually the institutions themselves, but if, as you framed it, Lynn, there's buy-in at the institutional level, then I think it's a time when real creativity can come from the conversations that have been happening.
Challenge that a bit. Like, you might want it, but if the obstacle is the institution itself, in what way can you mirror that back to ISS, or what way could the institution be an obstacle?
Well, I think the institutions, like I said earlier on, the architecture of the institutions and the norms, right, are often built on colonial legacies, right? The ideas that have supported researchers in Europe over time are constructed often around very colonial methodologies.
So it's in the very DNA of those institutions.
Yeah, so it's opening up a space to really reimagine and redo kind of the way that we're used to doing things. So the course that Rosalba gave an example of is a really good initiative, right? So, and that kind of will lead to other things as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you both. This was just the tip of the iceberg, I feel. But I'm still going to ask Inge to see, like, how do you reflect on what you just heard? Is there something that you're like,
Oh no, I know it from Rosalba and others already for quite some years.
Yeah.
So now I'm happy that I have been able to follow that discussion also with you.
But what would be the homework that you give yourself?
Oh, very much like, I think it's so important to go into this and take it along in the institute.
Yeah.
It's also related to where we started as ISS. We started in 1950. Just after the Second World War, just after decolonization of Indonesia. But of course we started like, okay, we are doing capacity building for them, which is in a way an old-fashioned way of thinking about collaboration, co-creation is completely different.
Yeah.
So international collaboration in Netherlands is changing this way as well. So it's supported by different groups actually to do it, also in society.
Yeah.
So I think it's so essential, and what I like, it's in the curriculum, it's in the research. I like your comment that you need actually the whole spectrum of different ontology, because it's not that we all have to do it, but we have to think and reflect on it. But it's also relevant for the institution, HR policy, personnel policy, and how do we do things together? How do we engage?
Yeah.
And what I get from that is learning to de-learn. So that's but that takes time. It also takes patience. It takes also kind of being kind to each other, because we are all raised in a certain way. So it takes patience and also compassion with others. It takes time to think in a different way.
Yeah.
But I think we need this so much in our institute.
And do you think that de-learning is indeed in learning from each other's perspectives, being open, asking the right questions?
Especially being open, self-reflection is very important. And this positionality, realizing where you stand, where you come from, but open and listening to people, trying to get the other perspective, and then having the dialogue on it.
Yeah.
So,
thank you. That's a wonderful reflection for now. We're going to round off this first theme, but again, I think it requires a lot more conversation to really get into this and really understand, well, what does it mean for each of us, right? What is our parts in decolonizing everything around us, basically. Thank you for this start. Before going into the next theme, we have a musical treat for you. We have a guitarist, Kees Gelderblom, who will play for us. And for that, it's very special that we're going to switch to a wonderful new space created by the wonderful Sandy in front of the one and only Butterfly Bar. Wonderful, welcome back. I am going to introduce our next topic to you, which is technology and development. And for that, we're going to listen to a keynote by Associate Professor Arul Chip, who is now still joining us from the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information in Singapore. But what not many people know is that in a few months' time, he will actually be joining ISS faculty. And I can tell you, he is going to be a very valuable addition. Arul, welcome.
Thank you.
Before you start, I want to remind our audience again that you can ask your questions to Arul via Mentimeter. So going to menti.com and putting in the code 148000750. And you'll be able to ask your questions or vote for a great question. So, Aru, I'm going to hand the floor to you.
Well, first, thanks to Rector Inger and for all the organizing members for all your hard work, for inviting me to celebrate ISS Dies. It's truly an honor and an opportunity to introduce myself to future friends and colleagues and students. My research area is ICT for D, or simply Technology for Development, a relatively new field of mere decades. This TED Talk style keynote allowed me to ponder on what ICT for D research has to offer for a world in flux, and to critically reflect on my own role in the field. In this talk, I will illuminate the relationship of technology to power, noting something that the previous talk really highlighted well, which is the positionality of individuals within hierarchical systems, and comment on issues of social justice. Embracing the zeitgeist of technological determinism, or the notion that technology was the answer to problems of development, the ICT4D field focused initially on technology transfer, as epitomized by myriad telecenter programs globally. This was premised on the notion that advanced technologies developed in the West could be transplanted to the global South if only enough devices could be made available to the people of the global South. The argument was, then development issues would be solved, giving rise to the digital divide, or the notion that if you only solve the problem of access, which I then joined in by delivering computers in Tamil Nadu, India, by creating gendership programs involving telecenters. Soon, the emphasis shifted from donation of old technologies to a focus on developing new and innovative forms of digital communication and information sharing, characterized by the OLPC, or the One Laptop Per Child program, of course, developed in the West at MIT Media Lab, which I then helped distribute to primary schools in the Himalayas. However, there were never going to be enough telecenters, enough laptops, enough electricity, enough capable teachers, enough of everything that would be required to make these programs a success. There was nonetheless an element that these ICT for D programs shared in common, which was an imbalance in power. These donor-led programs were characterized by power inequalities, certainly material wealth, that is the machines and devices, but also, importantly, the intellectual knowledge, in which the value lay with the donor, and the beneficiary was both deficient in these resources and grateful to be called a recipient. If only these children could access Wikipedia, then they could solve their village's issue of lack of running water, was the argument. Criticisms of digital divide issues and power imbalances found their miraculous resolution in the advent of mobile network technologies, epitomized by the mobile phone, the widespread diffusion of which to more than 90% of the global population solved these issues of access. These mobile technologies then initiated new cycles of innovation, this time with hopes of leapfrogging economic growth cycles, or the notion that developing countries, by not having invested in legacy technological systems, such as fixed line infrastructures, would find themselves in an advantageous position. Here, I participated in evaluating an HIV awareness and testing program in Uganda, utilizing this brand new technology of SMS texting to reach vulnerable populations such as teenage girls courted by older men. Oblivious to the socio-cultural practice that the men owned and shared the devices with the girls, thus asking these vulnerable teenagers to engage in an SMS quiz about unsafe sex, which would compromise their information with their partners. In this mobile healthcare app I designed, Indonesian midwives could be alerted about impending pregnancy complications with their female patients via a centralized algorithm-based system. Yet, the formal healthcare system, as well as the social system, were both premised on rules, patriarchal, that were hierarchical in nature. These midwives were then controlled by male doctors in the hospital, requiring their permission to enact medical procedures. For female migrant factory workers in peri-urban China, mobile phones and texting applications were used by family members to curtail their romantic relationships, by employers to track their movements, while allowing male colleagues to engage in sexual harassment, leading to these respondents to find refuge in safe spaces hidden away from the gaze of the public. For North Korean defectors to the south, some of them being sexually trafficked in the process, mobile phones were associated with chilling forms of state surveillance, wherein ownership or possession could be cause for imprisonment or execution. We note that issues of socio-structural power imbalances in these societies lingered. Indeed, communication technologies exacerbated existing socio-structural inequalities. We note that patriarchal social structure imposes identification, surveillance, and intervention upon the individual agency of women in these developing countries, with family members, colleagues, and employers using technology as a means of command and control. We can go further and note that power dynamics do not just play out in marginalized individuals' familial, professional, and state-citizen relations, but are increasingly being determined by transnational technological platforms beyond state control. The determining role of the social media company Facebook in the genocide against Rohingya Muslims has been brought to the attention of the International Criminal Court of Justice right beside you in The Hague. There is one distinction that my talk may be understating or promoting, which is the idea that development is often thought as happening over there, and we over here, even though I'm on the equator in Singapore, I would hardly call this the global south. We over here are creating the solutions. We should dispel this notion. Here we see non-state private militia or far-right anti-immigrant vigilante groups patrolling the borders of Europe against the tide of immigrants, enabled by digital technology of surveillance such as night vision cameras, smart sensors on fences, lie detector tests, facial recognition software, etc., a gamut of ICTs. Development, or lack thereof, happens there, but it also happens here. It happens wherever there are these massive inequalities in power relations in societies. It might seem that I'm making an argument for the dystopian relationship of technology to development. I would beg to differ. I instead argue for agentic resilience and resistance as marginalized individuals who appropriate digital technologies, engage in specific communication strategies of both use and non-use as means to negotiate the imbalance of social power in which they reside. In order to use the mobile phones and gain credibility in their villages, Indian midwives use strategies to legitimize ownership, such as falsely claiming their male relatives owned the project phones, or engaged in strategies such as hiding the phones. In order to ward off attention from male family members, female Chinese factory workers engaged in compartmentalization of context, separating their romantic and filial relationships onto different technology platforms. Female North Korean villagers worked hours in the middle of the night to distant hilltops to make clandestine contact with their female family members who had defected to safe refuge, escaping the tracking signals of the authorities. And Syrian refugees crowded into unsafe boats in the middle of the Mediterranean, coordinating the use of only one mobile phone at a time to ensure that they had enough battery for the journey to track their location on GPS, thus negating the plan of the smugglers to abandon them. It is an open question whether these individual strategies of resistance and resilience signify agency and confer empowerment, and or whether, in aggregate, these can create social transformation and provide justice to the marginalized. While uncertainty seems to characterize both our present and near futures, it should be clear at this point that we are in this boat together. Globally, as Rector Inge points out, societies appear to be facing crises of distrust. Crises not limited to ICTs, but within which ICTs are deeply embedded. Note the fake news related to the virus and vaccines and immigrants. Even as the world is ever increasingly connected, global information and cultural landscapes are characterized by ever higher degrees of distrust, not just towards traditional institutions like liberal democracy and educational and research institutions, but also towards the possibilities that people from different social positions and nations can collaborate to create common and equitable futures. Perhaps it's not technology that can save development, but these individual acts of appropriation, acknowledgement of shared resources, and collaborative demands of social justice that can save technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arul Cheap. We will come back to you with questions later, but first I would like to invite two of my guests here at the table, Professor Arjun Bedi, I'm sure many of you will know him, and PhD researcher Daniela Calmon, part of the Political Ecology Research Group, to reflect on what we've just heard. I would like to hear from you what stood out from Arul's talk, what inspired you, or where were you like, no, I disagree completely. Who wants to start? Both. Let's start with Daniela.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you, Arul. It was very interesting, and thanks, Lynn, and everyone organizing. I think a lot resonated. It was very interesting how he showed, indeed, these technologies being used for control, for surveillance, for forms of oppression and inequality, but also possibly being appropriated and used in other creative ways. I think in my field, more in environmental, climate, agrarian studies, researchers and activists have this big concern, like he said in the beginning, that technology is often shown as this big fix, right? That would be able to solve the issue of climate change, for example.
Right.
So I think we do have this big concern of showing how a lot of these technologies are reinforcing and perpetuating a lot of these socioeconomic systems that created the climate crisis.
In the first place.
Yeah, but at the same time, that doesn't mean, I think, like Arul said, that technology doesn't have a role to play in the energy transition.
Could you make that concrete for us, maybe with an example or something? How is technology perpetuating the inequalities that creates climate change in the first place? To just make it land a bit more.
There are a lot of examples, I think, in agriculture now that's being sold for people to engage in climate smart agriculture that would serve allegedly both to prevent climate change, but also help peasant farmer communities adapt. But we see that a lot of these technological packages, they actually are eroding traditional forms of agriculture that maybe already were more climate resilient and much more environmentally sustainable, and they're actually commodifying agriculture more. But because of this climate smart package, and because it's shown as technologically efficient, it's difficult sometimes for people to contest or to find a way to look at other technologies and possibilities.
Climate smart packages.
Yes.
I don't know what they are.
It's been used as a label for a lot of things, but often it is for these very high-tech genetic modified seeds, for pesticides, for this kind of agricultural package that requires a lot of inputs, a lot of energy and material, and more oil, actually. So it's very ironic that what's promoted as climate smart is a very oil-based agriculture system.
Yeah, interesting. Professor Arjun Bedi, can I ask you, how do you react? What's going on in your mind after listening to Arul?
Yeah, thanks, Arul. I think that he sketched a brief history of ICT, but the same can be said for other technologies as well.
Yeah.
That this has always been thought, technology has always been thought as a fix. So I think it's, you might say, in every 20 years, some new technology comes out, and we often get excited by that. And I think that's the same for ICT. I think there's a lot of excitement. It's quite clear that just providing devices and access is clearly not enough. But where I take a little bit of an issue with him is about, he argued that ICT exacerbates the problems. And that's not entirely clear to me, because for each example that was provided, you could provide perhaps a counter example of where it in fact bridges the gaps that you have. So for example, he talked about women being threatened or being bullied and so on, but at the same time you have, with these use of technologies, also lends you greater safety. So I think for each example he gives, I can find a counter example. So it's not so much per se the technology itself, it's how the technology is used and how that is rolled out. And I think, in fact, in a lot of ways, these new digital technologies, it lowers the literacy threshold that you need to use these technologies as compared to earlier technologies. So it's not clear to me that maybe he's just exaggerating it. Perhaps it was a bit too negative from my perspective,
right,
the way it was sort of articulated.
Let's ask him. I would like to bring Arul back in here, because we're saying two very different things. You're saying, indeed, technology, the status quo is that technology exacerbates existing power inequalities because the owner of the technology is actually the more powerful party. While Professor Arjun here is saying that for every example that you gave, he can give a positive counter-example where actually the gaps are being bridged. So are you exaggerating is his question. Or how do you respond to what he's saying?
I'll take that as a compliment from Professor Arjun, because the aim was to, in some ways, be provocative, so it worked. And I would perhaps say that for each example in which I showed the exacerbation of inequality, I showed the appropriation of the technology in the same space. I guess perhaps I might articulate this with an example. So we've heard of Ushahidi, which is the sexual harassment mapping software which is available, and women can perhaps mark out on this technology places where they've been sexually harassed, and it shows up on a map, and therefore your city may show up as zones which are safe for women, and then those which are unsafe, and therefore they can navigate their city more safely. Now, we can perhaps unpack this a little bit, because we have to realize that technology and its uses, as Professor Arjun stated, is appropriated or used differently by different audiences. So if we have people who have access to smartphones, high-speed internet, have digital literacies, they're more likely to be using this particular map. So then what do we see in terms of Ushahidi and the city is that the likelihood with the higher socioeconomic, more well-off, we can use this in racialized terms, females may mark out those spots in the city. Now suddenly we start seeing that those places start looking unsafe, which are these border areas between well-off neighborhoods and perhaps places which are articulated as slums, because it's rich women writing down those areas of sexual assault by poor men. But we are blind to perhaps the other instances of which this is happening. So I don't necessarily disagree with Professor Arjun. I think that perhaps technology amplifies, and this is an argument in the ICT for D field. The question is, who does it amplify benefits for, and who does it exacerbate for? It's not entirely clear, and more research is needed is perhaps where I would lay my hat.
Yeah, but it makes a lot of sense that what you're saying, that it's a matter of access, indeed, and ownership as well, and use, and yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about this, but I want to zone in on this overarching question of ISS, right, and the future of ISS, and the rapid development in the technological field, and also the ethical questions that Arul is raising around power, inequality, and access. What do you think should change at ISS to be, looped into this?
Well, I mean, I don't know about what should change at ISS, but what I do think is that, I mean, if I take a cue from the previous discussion plus what we talked about, is that to me that the world we are in, at least in terms of education programs and so on, I have 2 or 3 things to say. One is, I think the world is hybrid in terms of education and research now. 20 years ago, I led a program on digital technologies and development at the University of Bonn. And I wrote a piece and I called it Death of Geography, but it never happened. But I think we see it now. I think that indeed I feel more optimistic now that geography will not matter, should not matter. And at least from the perspective of ISS, I mean, the way I look at it is that we get large number of applications every year for our programs, and a quarter of the people can actually make it here. So to me, it's sort of almost a moral imperative that we should be out there teaching here and there. If we are serious about social justice, it should not be about just teaching out here, but also using these technologies. And yes, there are problems with the high-speed internet and smartphones and all sorts of things, but I think those are being resolved. So I think that's the way I see it, that our programs should be in both places. And I think it's almost, as I said, we should make more efforts to do that.
Yeah, so that's the
the way I see
opportunity
it.
of
The
technology
opportunity
here.
of technology out here.
Yeah, great. I think that's a very concrete thing we can offer ISS. I want to involve a question from the audience, which is, we also see that technology is not the solution for everything. What are other options of solving contemporary problems of the planet? I think Daniela is perfectly placed to briefly answer this, because we have to go
Well,
to
it
the
is a
next.
huge issue, solving the contemporary problems of the planet.
Yeah, all of them in one
Yes.
sentence.
No, but I'd say, indeed, if we look into, I think already you brought up a bit, there are issues of ownership, control over technology. I do think Arul brought these interesting points of individual appropriation, but it also has to do with collective control, more participation over them. Also, I think connecting to what Althea and Rosalba brought before, decolonizing knowledges and practices also relates to these themes, right?
Yeah.
And it has to do with also recognizing that technologies are not only produced in Silicon Valley, right? There are so many forms of knowledge and strategies that are being built around the world and have to be recognized. So I do think there are already so many interesting projects going on social, racial justice, climate justice, and it's part of joining in these groups and strengthening resistances that already exist.
Yeah.
And technology and the university can play a role in that, right? But we have to unpack what these technologies mean, what these projects mean in each case.
I really admire how you were able to answer this great question with a very concrete thing we can all do.
Yeah.
Strengthening existing resistances. Yeah. Great. Before we go into our final topic, we have the honor of listening to a message from the new Rector Magnificus of Erasmus University that ISS has been a part of. Very future-oriented young rector, Professor Annelien Bredenoord.
Dear colleagues and students, the International Institute of Social Studies, in its various forms, has been in existence for 69 years. And today we are celebrating this, and we are proud of it. Many congratulations. My name is Annelien Bredenoord, and since last week I am your new Rector Magnificus. As indicated before, during this celebration, we want to ask ourselves where we are growing from here. Decolonizing knowledge, technology and development, as well as social entrepreneurship, are themes that are central today. As I mentioned in my introductory speech during the rectorate transfer last week, as a society, as humans, we are entering a transition phase, and we can outline several contours of this transition. First, we are transitioning to the fourth industrial revolution, a revolution created by data, artificial intelligence, and converging technologies, where technology like biotechnology and AI come together and accelerate each other. Second, we are facing a geopolitical transition in which China and other emerging economies seriously challenge the hegemony of the United States. How we, as nations, navigate that new geopolitical reality will be critical to ensuring peace and cooperation. Thirdly, we face societal transitions. Our societies are becoming more diverse. The movement of people, information and ideas continue to create and develop shared cultures. Alongside this, we increasingly see the importance of ensuring inclusion for all to overcome new and long-standing social and economic challenges. Nonetheless, the major transition we face is the one from the Anthropocene, the era in which man has exhausted the planet, hopefully to an age of eco-humanism, in which man and humanistic values, as also propagated by Erasmus, are in balance with our living environment. Simply, through your research and the education that you give, it is you, the researchers of the International Institute of Social Studies, who are providing our community and our society with the tools to navigate these transitions. We have recently seen this in Afghanistan, where colleagues from ISS were conducting important research for many years. Despite the saddening scenes in recent months, we should not think that their efforts are in vain. We need critical minds that reach out across borders, disciplines, faculties and university walls, to the users of knowledge and technology, social organizations, to patients, governments and politics, artists, residents and businesses. In that regard, ISS continues to fly the flag, both for itself and Erasmus University Rotterdam. For Erasmus University, we see its unique task and mission to conduct research and education that positively impacts people, that addresses our major social issues, that trains the next generation to be positive social actors that can lead our society into the future. These values have always been a core part of your vision at ISS and across the EUR community. And we continue to take inspiration from them. As the Executive Board, we encourage you to continue with your critical research, continue offering vital education, and yes, to keep leading us through our societal transitions. You are all needed more than ever. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Professor Annelien Bredenoord, the new Rector Magnificus. It's time for our third and last topic, social enterprise. And I'm happy to be exchanging thoughts with fellow ISS alumna Lisa Jordan. Lisa is currently the Managing Director of DRK Foundation. And that foundation funds and supports early stage, high impact social enterprises. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm curious, being both ISS alumna and both in the field of social enterprise, how did your journey through ISS influence your path later on in this scene of social enterprise?
Oh, that's really funny. Yeah, maybe we could start with why social enterprise has become such a big deal. And it has a lot to do with what I learned at the Institute for Social Studies while I was there. When I was studying, I was looking at new social movements. And I wrote a paper about new social movements, which ultimately was published. And those social movements were really born out of the era of globalization, where the market took off without much constraint from government. And I think, like any good social activists, as the previous speakers were talking, younger people who grew up in this era of globalization see that the power in our world, the real power in our world, is in the marketplace. And this has prompted many young people, instead of going into government to write policy, or instead of going into an NGO to do good or to practice social justice, these young people have looked at the market and how can we use the market in order to create social goods. And I think that has a lot to do with that era from the early 1990s through to 2000, when we were really opening up something called the global marketplace. So I think that the attention to social enterprise, or part of the attention to social enterprise, really came from that era of globalization that I had the distinct honor and pleasure of trying to dissect while I was at the Institute for Social Studies.
Yeah,
and there's a second trend that you may recognize from your work as well, which is that the second trend, which also pertains to what we learn at ISS, is the shrinking space for civil society.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. And I think I recognize a lot of what you're saying in terms of what I value myself most of my journeying through ISS and becoming a very critical, very feminist, very international thinker, and still learning in that forever, always. Is that I value that most, just that critical outlook, that comparative outlook, where I learned that there is no single dominant truth, indeed, or there is a dominant truth, but we can always challenge it, and the world is changing so fast, as you're describing as well. But that mindset, that critical mindset, also to look at yourself critically and what you're trying to achieve as an entrepreneur, is crucial, because I feel there's so many social enterprises out there who are so self-congratulatory, maybe, thinking they're saving the world, but actually, if you look more critically, they're not. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder what you would say. I mean, if ISS wants to offer social entrepreneurship as a career path, basically, to the students that come through here, what would you advise, or what are the possibilities there?
So there's a third trend that ISS really helped me look at critically, because I was in the Politics of Alternative Development Strategies program, and I think the place to start with social enterprise from an academic perspective is the failure of the aid system and the growth of what we call non-governmental organizations that are worldwide brand names now, who have scandals, who are often perceived to be encroaching upon proximate leaders and proximate leadership in countries in which they operate, are not global in scope. They're really following that North-South paradigm, and that North-South paradigm is finished, as we heard about the hegemony of China, or China threatening the hegemony of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So I think if I were ISS and I were going to offer a program that examined critically the concept of social enterprise, I would start with what's wrong with civil society and the way that it's currently defined or understood or practiced in many places around the world. So that's probably where I would start. And then I would look at, okay, so let me just stop there, because this is a conversation, but that's where I would start.
To hear what you wanted to say.
Then I would probably go into the pros and cons of the type of social issues that can be addressed well through social enterprise or addressed well with market discipline, and those that really do not lend themselves to social enterprise processes. And in my own journey, my fascination, my lifelong fascination is with global social movements. It's not necessarily following the market and following the role of these new kinds of impact enterprises that are developing. It's really been with social movements. And I love that sort of dichotomy between focusing on a firm and building an organization, which is what the social enterprise is about, or building something that can anchor a movement. And what are movements really most valued for versus a social enterprise? So, for example, if we go to the last conversation that was just taking place around technology, and one of the things that technology has borne in our world is are these whole laborers who work for Uber, or bring your food to the door. These dot workers, they're called often, and they have no rights. They have absolutely no rights. And there's a giant database that's being collected about how people move, how people order, there's lots and lots of information, which is actually a source of wealth for the owners of these companies. You can't switch the ownership without having something like a labor movement among the dot worker. So a social enterprise isn't going to create that, but a social enterprise could, in fact, create the data platform in which these workers could start to collect their own data instead of giving it to Uber, collect their own data. And there's 2 firms that are trying to do that, one in the United States and one in the UK, and perhaps others around the world that I'm not aware of. So the social enterprise could be feeding a movement, but it cannot replace the need for a movement. So it's these kind of dynamics in civil society that's the joy of being able to study at a place like ISS. And these are not development versus non-development, or these are not north-south issues as the way in which we have understood our global dynamics. These are global issues. These are global realities that people are facing.
Yeah, that makes me think as well about this comment earlier of, strengthening existing resistances, right? And social entrepreneurs maybe needing the awareness to see like who is here fighting the fight and how can I feed that and support that. Yeah, interesting. Maybe a last question, because I know you work, from your position, you work a lot with high impact social enterprises, and ISS being an institution that wants to, heighten its own social impact. What do you think ISS would have to offer those social entrepreneurs you work with to really have an effect out there?
I think one of the things that I feel is really missing across the civic space that we have, whether it's more market-oriented or more policy-oriented or more politically oriented, which is different from policy orientation. One of the things that I think is really missing is the dialogue between the spaces. So I would love to see social enterprises that are concerned about climate change have a dialogue with the Black Lives Matter movement. I would really love to see social enterprises that are concerned about newcomers and migration across the globe have a conversation with social enterprises that are engaged in climate. And I'd like to see these encounters blossom, not based upon the market orientation or the governance orientation or the political orientation or the rights orientation, but what's the combination of actors that can emerge both a market that works for the 99%, which is not the market that we have today, and a governance process that allows us to capture the new knowledge and the wealth that is being created by the revolutions that we are seeing, and to serve populations across the globe in a much better way. Yeah. So I think that what ISS could actually offer is this broader scope of understanding and the opportunity to co-create that understanding between different forms of social engagement.
Yeah, definitely agree. Thank you, Lisa, for now. I would like to bring into the conversation 2 ISS thinkers. I have here at the table Dr. Georgina Gomez. Hi, nice to have you here. And all the way calling in from Colombia is PhD researcher and consultant Maria Pineda Escobar. Maria, are you with us?
Hi, yes, I'm here. I'm pleased to be with you, and I'm hoping that you can hear me well now.
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you for joining us. I want to ask you, reflecting as well on the conversation just now and bringing in your own... let me just start with this. Who are you and how do you relate to this topic of social enterprise?
Okay, thanks very much. I find this conversation fascinating, actually, because it brings in new topics into ISS, not so much for the people that want to think and do this critical thinking, which is fantastic, but then we have to do things.
Yeah.
And I think the distinctive issue, the distinctive characteristic about social enterprises is to go out there and do things.
Yeah.
Not via social movements and unlearning, but via introducing new ways of learning to do what 90% of the world is doing in a different way.
And can you very briefly describe how social enterprise comes back in your work?
I'm getting there.
Oh, sorry.
I'm getting there.
I'm skipping ahead.
Because precisely, I think the point is that this north and south dichotomy doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't existed for quite a few years by now. And what we have is people all over the world that want to have a better life, which is sustainable with planetary limits, which we know they are there by now. Nobody can, I mean, some people do ignore it, but well, at some point the planet will get back to them. So I think that the key issue that I find it so interesting is that social enterprises accommodate a variety of interests for people that want to do. And actually the key characteristic of social enterprises is, yes, the market encroachment. I think to some extent Lisa has mentioned this. It's an alternative to the so-called civil society and NGO world. I'm surprised she didn't mention government, but perhaps this is something I still want to ask her and challenge her why she hasn't addressed that aid as government's aid is actually also part of the failure. And social enterprises accommodate people like you that you want to do things differently. You've done your reflection and then you move on. Yeah, it's for people that are a bit impatient with the reflection part, and they say, well, what comes next? And of course, this is a very big box of people that some of them keep just the name and the memory of who they were and what drove them 2 decades when they started, 2 decades before when they started. And it also keeps or holds other people that want to do things differently. And I can give you a few examples. We have an alumni from India. She arrived at ISS full of life, and afterwards she got diagnosed with chronic disease that affects her joints, and she started making garments, clothes for people that have problems with, moving their hands, their arms, and so on. She's not in it for the profit. She's there because she addresses that there is this very key social need of so many people that need to dress differently and that cannot afford a €150 shirt made in France. There is a company in France that does this for profit. It's the alternative. It's the alternative for the 90% of the world.
Yeah. So it's a channel for the doer energy, you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Maria, can I ask you how you relate to this topic, but also maybe jumping into what opportunities you see for the combination ISS and social enterprise?
Yeah, okay. Well, very briefly, I'm doing my PhD in frugal innovation at ISS, and that would be in a nutshell how I jump into this topic. Because, well, before that, I have my professional background is in business, in international business, but I got fascinated by social business. And in my PhD, I'm just using social enterprises as my unit of analysis to understand how they relate with frugal innovation. And now, coming to your question, well, precisely, I mean, during the entire journey of today, because like all the talks have been very interesting, and I see a lot of relation between one and the other, I've been reflecting upon how best ISS could be relating to this. And of course, as a external PhD that is in the early stages, I have not such deep understanding of how ISS works, but what first came to my mind when I got the invitation to join this event was that precisely at this very moment, for example, I'm working together with Georgina, because Georgina is one of my tutors in my PhD, and under the leadership of Professor Peter Noringa, we are developing a course, a new course proposal for an frugal innovation online course that I think it joins very nicely what ISS could be doing, precisely as it has already been mentioned now. Like online, it's very relevant. It's part of this new normal. It's part of where we are going now. This hybrid world that it's precisely allowing me to be much more closer to ISS now, being in Colombia, than I would have been before the pandemic. I was aware that I would be an external student on my PhD, but through what has happened and the changes that have been occurring during this pandemic time, I have been feeling much more part and of the ISS community by activities like this. So this online learning, I think it's crucial. And this, for example, in this frugal innovation course, we are reflecting on whose knowledge counts. And this is really bringing into the table all types of knowledge that are relevant also in the scene of social entrepreneurs, as Lisa was mentioning, and Georgina as well. Like in social enterprises, there are many different actors that are engaged, and I think all this knowledge needs to be brought into the table with a non-hierarchical approach and with an inclusive approach, as it has been mentioned by other
Indeed, not only
participants
academic
earlier.
knowledge, not only academic knowledge, but also very many different types of knowledge from the stakeholders around social entrepreneurs. We're heading to the end of our event, but I want to ask you to respond very briefly on, if you could say, Inge, change this tomorrow to facilitate this collision of the worlds of ISS and social enterprise. What is it?
I would love to see more people engaged in this. What can we do tomorrow? Not what can we write, what can we research, what can we, advocate for, but what can we actually do tomorrow?
Yeah.
And how are we going to show that?
Yeah, it should be somewhere on the wall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for this exchange as well. I'm going to ask you to one last time. Wait, we have a question. Let's see if we can fit it in. What issues in international development could social enterprises more efficiently address than traditional organizations?
Anything that requires very big numbers. We can supply toilets to millions and millions of people through social entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Much faster than any multilateral government or
right. So
NGO
things that require skill, fast.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for this answer.
Very brief.
Yeah. I want to ask you to grab your phone one more time or your browser. Go to menti.com with our code 148000750. This time not to ask your questions, but to give your input to Inge, who has a question for you.
Yeah.
Inge, yes, please close us off.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for all presenters and participants of this afternoon. It has been so rich. And my head is full of all kind of new ideas. And it's so nice to think forward. So thanks.
Can you give us one example of an idea that's in your head?
One about de-learning, very much of unlearning, very much. What can we do tomorrow? I think that's also a very good question. And then about technology development or development and technology. So kind of and they all seem to link also these three different topics, because it comes back, like decolonizing is also unlearning different knowledge systems that you want to include in your work, not only the academic but also of other societal stakeholders. Very interesting, and I think we need some time to digest it. And to think about it. So thanks for everyone who put input. And my question is actually, we now organize this for the DS to have 3 topics, discuss it with guest speakers from outside, online as well, hybrid, with PhD researchers, with researchers staff. We might think about, there's going to be a podcast made out of this discussion. And we might think about organizing this at in a regular way, especially in the year that we're going to work on the new strategy, so that we have new topics in our strategy that we want to discuss with outside, inside, different people from inside. If people watching us can just give us suggestions about topics, issues that are important for our strategy, and actually really for when we are 75 years old, what will we look like? What will be different from now? Because the world is changing so fast. And I was touched by the Rector Magnificus, who said that we are considered a front runner by Erasmus University. And I want to keep that going actually. So that's in its societal relevance, everything that we do at ISS.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Inge's question, please go to that menti.com 1480075. Starting to sound like telemarketing here. And just like quickly drop your first thoughts, like what are approaches, topics, themes, anything that comes to mind that are relevant for ISS's new strategy, looking ahead, 23, 27, 2027, what's going to be important? We're going to close this off. We've journeyed together through 3 major themes and indeed discovered how interconnected they are, starting with decolonizing knowledge and moving on to technology, and also how technology might work in a colonial versus decolonial world, actually. Then social enterprise, that of course is enabled by technology in many ways, and that should also link back to the decolonizing struggle and existing resistance that we need to uplift. I want to thank all our speakers, Althea, Arul, Lisa. It was very enriching to have you all here. Of course, thank the ISS professors, associate professors, researchers, PhDs. Very valuable to have your input as well. Thanks a lot. We've heard power, dialogue, openness, doing, a lot to take home each of us. So thank you and stay in touch.